Hi everyone, my name is Zhou Jian, and today I would like to present my topic, the impact of PM2.5 air pollution on human health. Air pollution is becoming a serious environmental and public health issue around the world. Among different air pollutants, PM2.5 is considered one of the most harmful because its tiny particles can enter our lungs and even our bloodstream. In this presentation, I will explain what PM2.5 is, discuss its health impacts based on scientific studies, and introduce some possible solutions to reduce its effects. Now, let's start with the introduction. First, let me introduce PM2.5. PM2.5 refers to fine particulate matter with a diameter of 2.5 micrometers or smaller. Because these particles are extremely small, they can remain suspended in the air for a long time and travel deep into the respiratory system. The major sources of PM2.5 include vehicle emissions, industrial activities, biomass burning, and some natural sources such as dust and wildfires. One important characteristic of PM2.5 is that it can pass through the lungs and enter the bloodstream. As a result, long-term exposure may increase the risk of respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and other serious health problems. This is why PM2.5 has become an important environmental health, public health concern worldwide. Before moving to the main content, let me briefly introduce the objectives of this presentation. There are three main objectives. First, to explain the sources and characteristics of PM2.5. Second, to evaluate the impacts of PM2.5 exposure on human health based on scientific evidence. Finally, to summarize effective strategies for reducing PM2.5 pollution and protecting public health. With these objectives in mind, let's move on to the methodology. For this presentation, information was collected from reliable scientific sources. First, relevant literature was searched from trusted organizations and peer-reviewed journal articles. Then, the selected studies were carefully reviewed and compared to identify the major health effects of PM2.5. Finally, the information was summarized into different sections, including health impacts, research findings, and recommendations. Using scientific literature helps ensure that the information presented is accurate and evidence-based. Results and analyze. Now let's look at the results from previous studies. A systematic review includes 60 cohort studies conducted across the Asia-Pacific region. Most studies consistently reported that long-term exposure to PM2.5 is closely associated with increased health risks. Researchers also found strong evidence supporting stricter air pollution control policies and effective public health interventions. Overall, these studies provide reliable scientific evidence that PM2.5 has significant impacts on human health. This slide focuses on the major health effects of PM2.5. The respiratory system is one of the most affected. Long-term exposure can increase the risk of asthma, chronic bronchitis, and reduce lung function. PM2.5 also affects the cardiovascular system by increasing the risk of heart disease and stroke. In addition, several studies have linked PM2.5 exposure to diabetes and premature mortality. These findings show that PM2.5 affects multiple organs and has serious consequences for human health. This slide presents additional evidence from the systematic review. The prisma flow diagram shows the process used to select the studies included in the review. The bar chart summarizes the major health outcomes investigated by researchers. We can see that the largest number of studies focus on all-cause mortality, cardiovascular diseases, and respiratory diseases. These findings demonstrate that researchers from different countries have reached similar conclusions. Therefore, reducing PM2.5 pollution should be regarded as an important public health priority. Discussion. Based on these findings, there are three important points to discussion. First, PM2.5 remains a major environmental challenge, especially in rapidly developing cities with heavy traffic and industrial activities. Second, long-term exposure increases the risk of respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. Cardiovascular diseases, particularly among children, older adults, and other vulnerable populations. Finally, improving air quality requires joint efforts from governments, include industries and the public. Strengthening emission regulations, promoting clean energy, and increasing public awareness are all important steps toward reducing PM2.5 population. To conclude, there are three key messages from this presentation. First, PM2.5 is one of the most harmful air pollutants and has significant impacts on human health. Second, scientific evidence consistently shows that long-term exposure to PM2.5 increases the risk of respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and premature mortality. Finally, reducing PM2.5 pollution through cleaner energy, stricter emission control, and greater public awareness is essential for creating a healthy future. Protecting air quality means protecting our future. Thank you very much.